The air in Vincent Ross's study was thick with the smell of fear and old cigars, a scent Stella had come to know all too well. It was the smell of her childhood, of hushed arguments behind closed doors, of her father's desperate attempts to keep a sinking ship afloat. She stood silently by the window, her posture perfect, a statue of composure in a room teetering on the edge of collapse. She was the prize, you see, the final, untainted asset the Rossi family had left. And today, she was being offered up. The man across the desk was not like the men who usually came to see her father. Those men were loud, their threats veiled in bluster. This man, Rico, was a different kind of storm. He was silence. He sat in her father's worn leather chair as if it were a throne, his dark eyes scanning the room with a chilling disinterest. He hadn't so much as glanced at Stella, and that, more than anything, told her everything. She was not a person to him. She was an item on a balance sheet. The terms are simple, Vincent. Rico's voice was low, a soft rumble that demanded absolute attention. It wasn't a shout that made Stella's blood run cold, but the utter lack of emotion in it. You defaulted on your payment. The debt is now mine. I will clear every mark against your name. Your business, what's left of it, is under my protection. No one will touch you. Her father, a man who had once been so large in her eyes, seemed to shrink in his own chair. And in return, he whispered, the question hanging in the toxic air. Rico's gaze finally shifted, landing on Stella with the weight of a physical touch. It was an appraisal, cold and efficient. Stella becomes my wife. The words were so final, so absolute. A marriage. Not for love, not for dynasty, but for debt. Stella's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a gilded cage, but her face remained a placid mask. She had known this was coming. The whispers of a solution had been circulating for weeks. She remembered a time, long ago, when her father had made another losing deal, one that had cost them their summer home and her mother's jewels. She'd been too young to understand the details then, but she remembered the tension, the way her mother had cried. This was that same failure, amplified 1,000 times. She was the payment for all those past failures. Stella, her father's voice was pleading, begging for her to absolve him of his guilt. She turned from the window, meeting Rico's impassive stare. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. I understand, she said, her own voice surprisingly steady. I'll do it. The wedding was a swift, joyless affair in a cold city hall. Stella wore a simple, elegant cream-colored dress that felt like a costume. Rico stood beside her, a towering figure in a tailored black suit, his presence sucking all the air from the room. He repeated his vows with the detached tone of a man reading a business contract. When it was her turn, Stella's voice was a soft but clear echo in the quiet space. She felt the heavy weight of the gold band he slid onto her finger, a brand more than a promise. Afterwards, they drove to his estate in a silent, sleek car. The house was a monstrously beautiful thing of modern angles and glass, perched on a cliff overlooking the city. It was nothing like the warm, if often anxious, home she had grown up in. This was a fortress. A servant showed her to her room, a vast, luxurious suite with a breathtaking view. It was directly across a wide hallway from another door, which she presumed was his. The distance between those two doors felt like a mile-wide chasm. That first evening, he summoned her to his study, a room of dark wood and towering bookshelves. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the glittering city lights, a king surveying his domain. Let's be clear, Stella, he said, without turning around. His voice was that same, unnerving calm. This union is a formality. Ink on a page. You have provided me with a strategic advantage in consolidating my holdings. I have provided your family with a lifeline. That is the extent of our relationship. You will want for nothing material. But do not expect anything more from me. You will stay out of my way, and I will stay out of yours. Stella simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. He finally turned, and his dark eyes held hers for a long, searching moment, as if waiting for an argument, for tears, for something. When she gave him nothing but silent acceptance, he gave a curt, almost disappointed nod and dismissed her. Life in the fortress settled into a numb routine. They were two satellites orbiting the same silent planet, never colliding. She took her meals in the sun-drenched morning room, he in his study or at his office. She spent her days reading in the library or walking the meticulously kept gardens, always feeling the invisible walls of her gilded prison. But it was in these quiet observations that she began to see cracks in his armor. She saw the respectful way his head of security, a grizzled older man named Marco, spoke with him, a hint of genuine loyalty in his eyes. She witnessed Rico, from an upstairs window, gently patting the head of the guard's large dog that wandered the grounds, his usually hard features softening for a fleeting second. These were small things, tiny flickers of light in the overwhelming darkness of his presence, but they were enough to plant a seed of dangerous curiosity in Stella's mind. The man who claimed this marriage meant nothing was not, it seemed, entirely made of stone. And that made him infinitely more complicated, and more intriguing, than she had ever anticipated. The silence in the fortress on the cliff had become a living thing, a third occupant in the vast, cold space that Stella and Rico now shared. It was a silence that stretched for days, thick and heavy, broken only by the echo of footsteps on marble and the soft click of closing doors. Stella had become a ghost in her own life, drifting through the opulent rooms, her world reduced to the view from her window and the endless, empty hours. She adhered strictly to the unspoken rules of their arrangement, a phantom in the house of a man who pretended she did not exist. It was Marco, the loyal head of security, who finally shattered the quiet equilibrium. Stella was in the library, running her fingers over the spines of leather-bound books she felt no desire to read, when she heard his low, respectful voice in the hallway, followed by Rico's curt reply. "A week," Rico said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "It's a necessary performance. The Castellanos are getting bold. They need to see a united front, not a business transaction." "The arrangements are made, sir," Marco responded. "The villa on Isola Serafina is secured. No press, no outsiders. Just the staff." A honeymoon. The word echoed absurdly in Stella's mind. The idea of being alone with Rico, without the buffer of this enormous house and its staff, sent a jolt of pure, undiluted fear through her. This was no longer about coexisting in separate wings, it was about pretense, about playing a role under a microscope. 2 days later, they were on Rico's private jet. The cabin was the height of luxury, but the atmosphere was frigid. Rico spent the entire flight immersed in a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration, the blue light casting sharp shadows on his face. Stella stared out the window at the endless blanket of clouds, feeling further from her old life than ever before. She was a pawn being moved across a global chessboard, and she had no say in the game. Isola Serafina was a jewel box of an island, all rugged cliffs, secluded coves, and water so clear it seemed unreal. The villa was a masterpiece of modern design, all white stone and open spaces, built into the hillside overlooking a private crescent of white sand beach. It was paradise, and it felt like the most exquisite prison imaginable. The first day was a masterclass in avoidance. Rico claimed the office with its satellite communications, and Stella retreated to the beach. She walked along the shore, the warm, turquoise water lapping at her feet, the sun a welcome kiss on her skin. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of her old self emerge, the girl who craved simplicity and warmth. She swam in the sea, the salt water washing away the lingering chill of Rico's mansion, if not the memory of his disdain. That evening, they were forced together for dinner on the sprawling terrace under a canopy of stars. A table was set with fine linens, crystal glasses, and an array of exquisite food. It was a scene from a dream, but the silence between them was a nightmare. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the distant crash of waves. It was on the second night that everything shifted. They were at the same table, locked in the same stifling quiet, when a man approached. He was handsome, tanned, and clearly a guest from one of the other secluded villas, his confidence buoyed by expensive wine. "Excuse the interruption," he said, his smile dazzling and entirely focused on Stella, as if Rico were merely part of the scenery. "I couldn't help but notice. You're far too beautiful to be sitting here all alone. My friends and I are having a party just down the beach. You should join us, bring some light to our evening." It was an innocent enough offer, a simple mistake. But in their twisted world, it was a transgression of the highest order. Stella felt the air around Rico change before she even looked at him. The casual, bored energy that usually radiated from him vanished, replaced by a stillness that was more threatening than any sudden movement. She opened her mouth to politely decline, but Rico was faster. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head, and the look in his eyes was so utterly devoid of humanity, so chillingly cold, that the man actually took a step back. "She is not alone," Rico said, the words dropping into the night air like shards of ice. He reached out, his movement fluid and possessive, and his hand closed around Stella's wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute, a brand of ownership. He pulled her chair closer to his, the legs scraping against the stone terrace, the sound unnaturally loud. "She is my wife." The words were a declaration, a warning, and a promise all at once. The man stammered an apology, his face pale, and practically fled back into the darkness. In the sudden quiet that followed, Rico did not release her wrist. His thumb rested against the frantic pulse beating beneath her skin. Stella could feel the heat of his hand, the surprising strength in his fingers. She could smell his cologne, something dark and spicy, mixed with the clean scent of the sea. Her heart was hammering, a wild, terrified rhythm, but intertwined with the fear was something else, something hot and sharp and entirely unwelcome, a thrill. He had called her his wife. Not a business partner. Not a key to a lock. His wife. And the way he had said it, the raw, primal possessiveness in his tone, had ignited a spark deep within her. He finally turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes blazing with an emotion she had never seen in them before, not indifference, but a fierce, blazing intensity. The wall between them, for that one electric moment, had not just cracked, it had been utterly obliterated. The silence that now stretched between them was no longer empty. It was charged, volatile, and filled with a question that hung in the balmy night air, waiting for an answer neither of them knew how to give. The air on the terrace was no longer balmy, it was thick, charged with a current that made it difficult to breathe. Rico's hand was still wrapped around Stella's wrist, a burning brand against her skin. The word wife seemed to hang between them, its echo shifting from a statement of cold fact to a claim of something far more visceral. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The distant sound of the waves was the only reminder that the world outside this tense bubble still existed. Slowly, deliberately, Rico released her. His fingers uncurled, but the ghost of his grip, the heat of it, remained seared into her flesh. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving her face, studying her with a new, unnerving intensity. The mask of bored indifference was gone, replaced by the focused scrutiny of a predator who has just spotted unexpected movement in the undergrowth. "It seems we need to be more convincing," he said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow different from the cold tone he usually used with her. It was warmer, laced with a hint of the possessiveness he had just displayed. Stella, her heart still performing a frantic drum solo against her ribs, could only manage a slight nod. She pulled her wrist back into her lap, cradling it as if it were injured. In a way, it was. The contact had shattered the illusion of their separate existences. The following day, the dynamic between them shifted into a strange, new territory. Rico did not retreat to his office. Instead, he found her on the terrace after breakfast, where she was pretending to read a novel she hadn't absorbed a single word of. "Come," he said, it was not a request, but it lacked its usual edge of command. "I'm going to the cove on the north side. The water is clearer there." It was the first time he had ever invited her to do anything. Stunned, Stella set her book down and followed him. They walked along a steep, winding path down the cliffside, the silence between them now filled with the cries of gulls and the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. It was not the comfortable silence of companionship, but the heavy, waiting silence of two people navigating a minefield. At the cove, the water was indeed a breathtaking shade of sapphire. Rico, without a hint of self-consciousness, stripped off his shirt and dove in. Stella stood on the sand, her eyes involuntarily tracing the powerful lines of his back, the play of muscles under sun-kissed skin. He was all coiled strength and controlled power, a stark contrast to the elegant suits that usually contained him. He surfaced, pushing his wet hair back from his forehead. "Are you coming in?" he called out, and for the first time, she heard a challenge in his voice that wasn't about business or territory. It was a personal dare. Swallowing her nerves, she slipped off her cover-up and walked into the cool, clear water. They didn't speak, just swam in the vast, blue silence, orbiting each other like wary celestial bodies. Later, as they lay on the warm sand, the sun drying their skin, he spoke, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "My father built his empire on fear," he said, the words coming out as if forced from him. "He believed loyalty was bought with blood or money. Nothing else." It was the first piece of himself he had ever offered her. Stella remained still, afraid that any movement would make him stop. "I was 12 the first time I saw a man killed for disloyalty," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which made the horror of the statement even more profound. It was a lesson. The only one that mattered. Stella's breath caught in her throat. She thought of her own father's failures, the losing deals made from desperation, not cruelty. They were worlds apart, she and Rico, born into different kinds of prisons. "My father's lessons were about balance sheets," she said softly, not looking at him. "About how a single wrong number could make everything vanish." The fear was quieter, but it was always there. He turned his head on the towel, his eyes meeting hers. It was a look of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, if different, burdens. That night, the pretense continued. They dined together again, but the silence was different. It was thoughtful, charged with the unspoken confidences of the day. A bottle of wine was shared, its rich, dark flavor loosening the remaining threads of their restraint. They spoke of books, of art, of things that had nothing to do with debts or empires. Stella found herself laughing at a dry, witty observation he made about a famous painting, the sound of her own laughter surprising her. She saw a flicker of something warm in his eyes in response, a glimpse of the man he might have been without the weight of his legacy. After dinner, they walked along the moonlit beach. The sand was cool under their feet, the sea a shimmering expanse of silver and black. They stopped, side by side, watching the play of moonlight on the water. The air between them was alive, humming with a tension that had been building since the moment he had grabbed her wrist. Stella turned to say something, she didn't even know what, but the words died in her throat. Rico was looking down at her, his expression unreadable in the shadows, but his intensity was a palpable force. He reached out, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was shockingly gentle, a stark contrast to the possessiveness of the night before. "Stella," he murmured, her name a whisper on his lips, a question and an answer all at once. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle first kiss. It was a claiming, a surrender, an explosion of all the pent-up tension, curiosity, and raw attraction that had been simmering between them since the beginning. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against the hard, unyielding wall of his chest. One of his hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back, while the other splayed against the small of her back, holding her to him as if he were afraid she might vanish. Stella's hands came up, gripping his shoulders, her fingers digging into the firm muscle there. She wasn't pushing him away, she was anchoring herself in the storm of sensation. The world narrowed to the feel of his mouth on hers, the taste of wine in him, the scent of sea salt in his skin. It was a kiss that held all his controlled fury and all her suppressed passion, a collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The world rushed back in, the sound of the waves, the cool night air on their heated skin. Rico rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide, reflecting the starlight and a dawning, terrifying realization. He had lost control. The carefully constructed wall around his emotions lay in ruins at his feet. And in that vulnerable, breathless silence, under the watchful eye of the moon, the first shot rang out. It was a sharp, ugly crack that shattered the night's magic, followed instantly by the whine of a bullet embedding itself in the wooden post of the dock just feet from where they stood. Rico's reaction was instantaneous. The lover vanished, and the predator took over. A guttural sound ripped from his throat, "Down!" and he threw himself on top of Stella, driving them both hard onto the sand, his body a shield over hers as more shots peppered the beach, sending plumes of sand erupting around them. The honeymoon was over. The real world, with all its brutal dangers, had found them. The world dissolved into a chaos of violent sound and instinct. The roar of the waves was drowned out by the sharp, percussive cracks of gunfire and the sickening thud of bullets biting into sand and wood. Rico's body was a solid, immovable weight on top of Stella, pressing her into the cool, gritty sand. She could feel the hard ridge of the gun he now held in his hand, pressed against her side, and the frantic, powerful beat of his heart against her back. It was not the rhythm of fear, but of a fearsome, focused rage. "Don't move," his voice was a raw, guttural command breathed directly into her ear. His arm was a steel band across her back, pinning her down. Stella squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers clawing into the sand. This was the world he lived in. This was the reality behind the suits and the silent mansions. It wasn't the cold business deal she had feared, it was this, a beach drenched in moonlight and bloodshed. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. Shouts echoed from the direction of the villa, Marco's voice, barking orders. The sound of scuffling, a single, final gunshot, and then an eerie, ringing silence descended, broken only by the gasp of Stella's own breath and the relentless crash of the sea. Rico did not move immediately. His body remained tensed over hers, a human shield waiting for a second wave that didn't come. Only when Marco called out, "Clear, Rico. It's clear," did the terrible tension in his frame lessen by a fraction. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the tree line, his gun still held ready. He looked down at Stella, his face a mask of hardened fury, but his eyes held a different, more terrifying emotion, a raw, undisguised fear. Not for himself, but for her. The sand was streaked where his body had protected hers. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice rough. His free hand was already moving over her arms, her back, checking for injuries with a frantic urgency that belied his controlled exterior. I'm okay, Stella stammered, her own voice trembling. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her body shaking uncontrollably. His gaze swept over her once more, confirming her words, and the fear in his eyes solidified back into a cold, murderous rage. He stood up in a single, fluid motion, pulling her to her feet with him, keeping her tucked firmly behind his back as Marco and two other men approached. The Castellanos, Marco said, his face grim. 2 men. A probing attack. They're handled. Rico gave a short, sharp nod. His jaw was so tight it looked like it might crack. Double the perimeter. No one gets within a mile of this villa. His orders were clipped, absolute. He turned his attention back to Stella, his eyes sweeping over her sand-covered, trembling form. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms. Stella gasped, her arms instinctively wrapping around his neck. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, his stride long and purposeful as he moved away from the beach, back towards the villa. He didn't set her down until they were inside the master suite, the door locked securely behind them. He set her gently on the edge of the large bed and knelt before her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice low but intense. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide with shock. "This will not happen again. I will burn their entire organization to the ground for this. For touching you." The vow was uttered with such ferocious certainty that it stole the air from her lungs. This was not the calculated response of a businessman whose asset had been threatened. This was the primal roar of a man whose woman had been endangered. He stood and began to pace the room like a caged tiger, the adrenaline still coursing through him. "This was my fault," he snarled, more to himself than to her. "I let my guard down. I was distracted." He stopped his pacing and turned to face her, his chest heaving. The controlled, untouchable Mafia boss was gone. In his place stood a man stripped bare, his emotions raw and exposed for her to see. The wall was not just cracked, it was dust. "This marriage," he began, his voice dropping, losing its edge and becoming almost hoarse. "It was supposed to be nothing. A transaction. A piece of paper." He took a step towards the bed, his dark eyes burning into hers. "But you are not nothing." He came to her then, sinking to his knees in front of her again, his hands coming up to frame her face. "That man on the beach, when I saw the shooter. Stella, I have never felt fear like that in my entire life. The thought of losing you," he shook his head, as if the very concept was incomprehensible. "I can't. I won't." Tears she didn't know she was holding back began to stream down Stella's face, cutting paths through the fine sand on her cheeks. "This started as a deal," he whispered, his thumb brushing away a tear. "But it's not a deal anymore. Not for me. You are my wife. In every way that matters." And then he kissed her again. But this kiss was nothing like the first. It was not a claiming born of passion, but a surrender born of something far deeper. It was slow, tender, and devastatingly sincere. It was a confession, a vow, a prayer. It was the final, silent shattering of the contract that had bound them. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I love you, Stella," he breathed into the space between them. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the room with the force of a detonation. "I think I have from the moment you didn't cry in my study." A sob escaped her, but it was a sound of relief, of joy, of a heart finally unlocking. She brought her hands up, covering his where they held her face. "I love you, too, Rico," she whispered. "I tried not to. But I do." The admission hung in the air, soft and profound, banishing the last remnants of the violence from the room. He stood, pulling her up with him, and his hands went to the hem of her sandy, damp dress. "Let me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. This time, it was not a command, but a request. And Stella, her heart full and her soul laid bare, nodded. What followed was not the frantic collision of two bodies on a beach, but a slow, deliberate exploration. It was the gentle removal of clothing, not just fabric, but of the last remaining barriers between them. It was the touch of hands on newly bared skin, a silent language of reverence and discovery. It was the meeting of their bodies in the soft light of the bedroom, a joining that was as much about the soul as it was about the flesh. It was a conversation of sighs and whispered names, of trembling touches and shared warmth. It was the final, absolute consummation of a vow that had, only hours before, been meaningless ink on a page. The paper marriage was gone, and in its place, something real, something powerful, and something unbreakable was born in the quiet, safe darkness of the villa, as the moon continued its silent journey across the sky. The return to the city was a homecoming, but the home they returned to was not the same one they had left. The fortress on the cliff was no longer a gilded cage for Stella, but a stronghold for their newfound, fiercely protected love. The silence that had once been cold and empty was now a comfortable, shared quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding that flowed between them. The separate bedrooms became a relic of a past life, a story they would one day tell with a shake of their heads and a private smile. The master suite, once solely Rico's domain, now held her clothes in the closet, her books on the nightstand, the scent of her perfume mingling with his in the air. The change in Rico was visible to everyone, a seismic shift in the foundation of his world. He no longer ate alone in his study. Breakfast was a shared ritual on the sunlit terrace, where he would often find his hand covering hers on the table, his thumb absently stroking her skin as he read reports. He sought her opinion, not on the brutal mechanics of his business, but on the people, the alliances, the long-term strategies. "You see things I don't, Stella," he'd tell her, his gaze thoughtful. "You see the heart of a man, not just his balance sheet." She had become his conscience, his confidant, the calm center in the storm of his life. But the outside world had not forgotten them. The Castellano family, emboldened by their failed attack on the island, saw Rico's new, public devotion to his wife not as a strength, but as a vulnerability. They began to move, making small, aggressive plays against his territories, testing his resolve, whispering in the underworld that the great Rico Moetti had gone soft, his judgment clouded by a woman. The climax came not with a whisper, but with a declaration of war. Rico summoned the heads of his family, all the capos and lieutenants who commanded his men, to the very study where he had once coldly told Stella their marriage meant nothing. The room was packed with powerful, dangerous men, the air thick with cigar smoke and tension. Stella watched from the doorway, unseen, her heart pounding. This was his world, the one he had always kept her separate from. Rico stood before them, not behind his desk, but in front of it. He wore his power not as a suit, but as a second skin, his presence dominating the room. "The Castellanos believe they have found a weakness," he began, his voice cutting through the murmurs, cold and sharp as a blade. "They believe that because I have found something worth living for, I have lost what it takes to make others fear to die." He paused, letting his words sink in. His gaze swept over the hardened faces of his men. "They are wrong." The two words were a death sentence. "What I feel for my wife does not make me weak. It makes me ruthless. It gives me a reason to be merciless. Before her, this empire was built on money and fear. Now, it is built on a foundation I will defend with every breath in my body, with every drop of blood in my veins." He turned then, and his eyes found Stella's in the doorway. He didn't look away as he finished speaking, his words meant for her as much as for his men. "Stella is not my weakness. She is my strength. She is not a distraction. She is my reason. From this moment forward, an insult to her is an insult to me. A threat to her is a declaration of war against all of us. And that is a war we will win." He extended his hand toward her. Every head in the room turned to look at her. There was no pity in their eyes now, no dismissal of her as a mere bargaining chip. There was only a new, profound respect. She was the woman who had tamed the wolf, not by breaking his spirit, but by earning his heart. She was his queen, and they all bore witness as she walked into the room and placed her hand firmly in his. The war that followed was swift, brutal, and absolute. But Rico fought it differently. He fought not for the thrill of power, but for the promise of a future with Stella. He was colder, more calculating, and more terrifying than ever before because his cause was just in his eyes. He was no longer just a boss protecting his territory, he was a man protecting his home, his heart, his very soul. Months later, the threat of the Castellanos was a memory. The city was quiet, the territory secure under a new, unshakable peace. On a cool, clear evening, Rico took Stella back to the gardens of his estate. He led her to a stone bench overlooking the city lights, the very lights he had once stared at alone. He took both of her hands in his touch familiar and filled with a love that still sometimes stole her breath. "This marriage began with a deal I forced upon you," he said, his voice soft. "A deal that meant nothing." He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "I was a fool. I am offering you a new deal, Stella. A new promise. Not out of necessity, but out of love. A promise to stand by your side, to protect you, to cherish you, for the rest of my life. This marriage, you mean everything to me." He didn't need a ring. The vow was enough. Stella leaned forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy, and kissed him, sealing their new, eternal contract, written not on paper, but on their hearts. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Their story, a journey from a cold deal to a burning, all-consuming love, has found its happy ending. But the world is vast, and many more hearts are waiting in the shadows, yearning for their own chance at a forbidden romance. If you craved the tension between Rico and Stella, the transformation from icy indifference to fierce passion, then you won't want to miss what comes next. Asterisk asterisk subscribe to the channel asterisk asterisk to be the first to discover the next tale of love that conquers even the darkest of pasts. A new story is waiting to begin.